She lived alone in the middle of nowhere. Until 7 men asked to spend the night, Martha had lived alone for as long as she could remember. Her home was not in a busy city or a small town, but deep in the middle of nowhere. Tall trees surrounded her little wooden cabin, their leaves whispering with every gust of wind. Birds sang in the mornings, and the distant howl of wolves sometimes pierced the quiet nights. To some, her life might have seemed lonely or even frightening, but to Martha, it was perfect. She had chosen this solitude carefully, and it had become a part of who she was. Every morning Martha woke up just before the sun peeked over the horizon. The first light of day spilled across the forest floor in golden streaks, and she would sit on the small wooden porch, sipping hot tea from a chipped ceramic mug. The forest was calm at this hour, almost sacred, and she found comfort in the stillness. It was in these quiet moments that she felt alive, surrounded by the simple beauty of nature, far away from the chaos of the outside world. Martha's cabin was small but sturdy. She had built it herself many years ago when she first decided to leave the noisy, crowded life behind. The wooden walls were weathered and had a soft scent of pine that filled the air, even indoors. Inside, the cabin was tidy. A single bed was tucked into one corner. A small stove sat in the center of the room, and shelves lined with books and jars of dried food covered the walls. She had everything she needed and nothing she didn't. Life was simple, and that simplicity gave her peace. Her days were filled with routine. But Martha never felt bored. She chopped wood for the fire, tended her tiny garden where she grew potatoes, carrots, and a few herbs, and collected water from a nearby stream. She loved these tasks because they reminded her that she was capable and independent. Living alone meant she had to rely on herself for everything, and she took pride in that. Every morning she would rise early to feed the chickens she kept in a small pen outside. Their clucking and scratching brought life to the quiet cabin, and she often smiled as she watched them peck at the ground. Martha's life in the forest was not without challenges. Winters were harsh, and the snow could fall for days without stopping. There were nights when the wind howled so loudly it felt as though it would tear the roof from her cabin. But she had learned to prepare for such times. Her shelves were stocked with food that could last for months, and she always made sure the woodpile was full. She had learned to adapt and survive, and she found strength in that. In a world where so many depended on others, Martha depended only on herself. Despite her love for solitude, Martha was not unkind. She had helped lost travelers on rare occasions, offering directions or sometimes a meal if they came to her door. But most of the time she enjoyed being alone. She had her books, her chickens, her garden, and the forest. She didn't need anyone else to be happy. People from the nearby town had called her strange or odd because of her lifestyle, but she didn't mind. She had discovered that peace and happiness were found in small moments, watching the sunrise, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, or listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Martha's past was part of the reason she had chosen such a solitary life. Years ago, she had lived in a busy city with a career, friends, and even a romantic relationship. She had worked long hours and been surrounded by people, yet she had never felt content. The constant noise, the endless demands, and the feeling of never truly being herself had worn her down. After a difficult breakup, she had realized that she needed space and silence to heal. She wanted to find herself again, and the city could not give her that. So she left everything behind and sought a life where she could be fully free. The forest had welcomed her. It offered a rhythm of life that was steady and honest. The sun rose and set, the seasons changed, and life continued without unnecessary complications. She had learned to read the signs of the forest, the patterns of birds in the sky, the subtle movements of animals in the undergrowth. and even the change in the wind before a storm. These lessons gave her a sense of connection that she had never experienced in the city. Every day brought a small adventure, even if it was just spotting a fox crossing the path near her cabin or discovering a patch of wild berries. Evenings were Martha's favorite time of day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she would light a fire in the small stove and sit by it, reading a book or simply watching the flames dance. The world outside the forest seemed distant, almost unreal. In those moments, she felt completely herself, untangled from expectations, free from judgment. She would sometimes hum softly or make tea and write in a small notebook she kept for reflections. Writing helped her process her thoughts, and often she would record observations about nature or the small joys she noticed throughout the day. Martha was also careful. Living alone required vigilance. She knew the forest could be beautiful, but it could also be dangerous. Wild animals roamed freely, and the terrain could be tricky to navigate, especially during storms or snow. She had learned to trust her instincts and to respect the land around her. She had first aid knowledge, survival skills, and the experience to handle emergencies. Yet she also understood the importance of humility. No matter how skilled she was, the forest was vast and unpredictable. Though she had embraced this solitary lifestyle, there was a part of Martha that sometimes wondered what it would be like to share it with someone else. Not because she felt lonely, but because humans are naturally social creatures. Still, she had made a promise to herself. She would only allow another person into her life if it felt right, if they respected her world and the peace she had built. Until that time, she would remain in her little cabin, surrounded by trees, animals, and the quiet rhythm of the forest. One night, as Martha lay in bed listening to the wind, she felt the deep satisfaction of being fully independent. She had created a life that was challenging, yes, but also deeply rewarding. She had found a rhythm that suited her perfectly. There were no alarms, no deadlines, no expectations from anyone else. Only her, the forest, and the life she had chosen. And that thought made her smile as she drifted into sleep, unaware that soon her peaceful routine might be interrupted in the most unexpected way. Martha had always known that living alone in the middle of nowhere carried certain risks, but she had never feared them too much. The forest, though wild, had a rhythm she understood. She knew when to move quietly, when to keep a fire burning, and how to track the weather through subtle changes in the air. She had grown comfortable with her routines, and each day flowed predictably. That predictability made her feel safe, almost like the forest itself was protecting her. But one evening, everything changed. It started with the wind. It had been calm all day, but as the sun dipped low behind the trees, a sudden chill swept through the forest. The branches rattled, and the leaves rustled more loudly than usual. Martha sensed something unusual in the air. She had learned to notice these things over the years, the small signs that nature gives before a storm. She glanced out the cabin window and saw dark clouds rolling quickly across the sky. Rain would come soon, and the forest would be transformed in a matter of minutes. Martha decided to finish her evening chores quickly. She fed the chickens, checked the firewood supply, and closed the shutters against the coming rain. Just as she was about to pour herself a cup of tea, she noticed movement near the edge of the forest. 7 figures were making their way through the trees, their pace hurried and uneven. Martha's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't used to seeing anyone in this part of the forest, especially not at this time of day. For a moment, she considered ignoring them. After all, who were they? Strangers in her world could be dangerous, but something in the way they moved suggested urgency rather than malice. They looked tired and wet, and they were carrying heavy backpacks. Martha's curiosity and sense of responsibility won over her caution. She walked to the front door and stepped onto the porch, her eyes scanning the figures through the dimming light. The 7 people stopped when they saw her. They were a mix of ages and appearances, but all looked exhausted and anxious. One man, who seemed to be the leader, waved politely and called out, "Excuse me, ma'am, could we rest here for a little while? We're caught in the storm." His voice was calm, and there was no hint of threat. Martha studied him carefully, noticing the rain-soaked clothes and the tired lines on his face. Her first instinct was fear, but she quickly weighed it against what she knew was right. She had always believed in helping people in need. She also knew the storm could get worse quickly, and she could not leave them outside in the cold. Taking a deep breath, Martha nodded. "You can stay," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "But please, wait outside for now. I'll make a fire and bring you some blankets." The group hesitated for a moment, but then agreed, clearly relieved. They settled on the ground near the cabin, huddled together as the first drops of rain began to fall. Martha hurried inside to light the stove and gather blankets. Her mind raced with thoughts of safety. 7 people were a lot to bring inside her small cabin, but she trusted her instincts and the natural caution she had developed over years of living alone. Once the fire was crackling and the blankets ready, she stepped outside with a tray of warm tea and a few sandwiches she had prepared earlier. The men thanked her sincerely, their relief evident in their tired eyes. They accepted the food politely and took small sips of the warm tea, letting it chase away the chill from their bones. Martha watched them quietly, noting their manners, their exhaustion, and the way they spoke softly among themselves. There was no aggression, no sense of danger, just a group of people caught in an unexpected situation. As the storm intensified, the wind howled through the trees, and rain lashed against the cabin walls. The forest, usually a source of comfort for Martha, now seemed to press in on all sides. She felt the tension of the unknown, but also the strange warmth of human connection. The men shared bits of their story, explaining that they had been hiking in the nearby mountains and had lost their way. They had tried to find shelter, but the storm had forced them further from their path. Martha listened carefully, nodding as they spoke. She could sense their honesty and the genuine need for help. Hours passed. The storm showed no sign of letting up, and Martha realized she had to make another decision. It was no longer safe for them to stay outside under blankets in the rain. Carefully, she opened the cabin door wider and gestured for them to come inside, one at a time. The space was cramped and she had to organize sleeping spots on the floor, but everyone followed her instructions respectfully. They kept their voices low and their movements careful, as if understanding the delicate balance of her life here. Inside, the atmosphere changed. The warmth of the fire contrasted sharply with the cold and wet world outside. Martha poured more tea and offered some simple snacks. The men thanked her again, this time with visible gratitude. She noticed the small details, the nervous glances exchanged between some of them, the way a few smiled faintly despite exhaustion. Martha realized that while they were strangers, they were human beings, just like her, caught in circumstances beyond their control. She spent the evening talking to them cautiously. The leader of the group introduced himself as Daniel, a man in his early 30s with calm eyes and a gentle voice. One by one, the others shared their names: Thomas, Peter, Raj, Simon, Luis, and Javier. Each had their own story, but they were united by the simple fact that they were now strangers in a storm, relying on someone else for help. Martha listened, asking questions politely but keeping certain details of her own life private. She valued her boundaries and knew that trust had to be earned, even in moments of need. As the night wore on, Martha found herself observing them more closely. Some were quiet and reflective, sitting near the fire and warming their hands. Others whispered to each other in low tones, making plans for the morning. Despite the circumstances, they treated her with respect, careful not to overstep into her space. Martha had expected tension or chaos, but there was none. The night became a quiet experiment in human behavior, how strangers interact when thrown together by necessity. At one point, a loud crack of thunder shook the cabin, and rain pounded against the roof. One of the younger men, Peter, flinched visibly. Martha offered him a reassuring smile and reminded everyone to stay calm. She realized that while she had spent years alone, the presence of others could bring both comfort and stress. Yet she also felt a surprising sense of pride. She had managed to create a safe space in the forest, and now she was extending that protection to others, even if only for one night. As the fire dwindled and the night grew deeper, the storm outside seemed to grow fiercer. The forest, which usually brought Martha peace, now felt vast and overwhelming. But inside the cabin there was a sense of warmth and solidarity. The men huddled together under blankets, and Martha kept watch quietly, making sure everyone was comfortable. She realized that despite the initial fear, this unexpected intrusion had brought life and energy into her quiet world. For hours, the cabin was filled with soft murmurs, the occasional clink of a cup against the tray, and the steady sound of the fire crackling. Martha found herself reflecting on the unusual turn of events. She had lived alone for years, enjoying the predictability of her days. But tonight, the forest had reminded her that life was unpredictable, and that sometimes connection could appear when least expected. She wondered what kind of people these strangers really were, and whether she had judged them too quickly or not enough. By the time the storm began to subside in the early hours of the morning, Martha felt a strange mixture of relief and curiosity. Relief because the worst of the storm had passed, and curiosity about the 7 men who now slept, exhausted, on the cabin floor. She quietly tidied the space, making sure blankets were arranged neatly and that everyone was as comfortable as possible. In those silent moments, she reflected on the strange ways life can bring people together, even in the most remote and isolated places. Though she had been cautious, Martha realized that tonight had shown her a different side of humanity. The men had been polite, honest, and grateful. They had respected her space and her rules, and in return, she had given them safety, warmth, and shelter. For a woman who had spent years alone, this small act of trust felt significant. It reminded her that even in solitude, moments of human connection could happen, and sometimes they were both necessary and unexpected. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Martha stood on the porch again, watching the forest glisten with rain. The storm had left a fresh, clean scent in the air, and the world seemed renewed. She thought about the men inside her cabin and how this night would change all of them in ways they could not yet see. For her, it was a reminder that life, no matter how carefully managed, could always surprise you. And sometimes, those surprises were worth embracing. The morning after the storm was unlike any Martha had seen in years. Sunlight spilled through the trees, making the wet leaves sparkle as if the forest itself were celebrating a new beginning. The air smelled fresh and alive, carrying hints of pine, earth, and the faint scent of the rain that had just passed. Birds chirped energetically, hopping from branch to branch, and somewhere in the distance a deer cautiously moved through the undergrowth. It was the kind of morning that made Martha pause, take a deep breath, and feel completely at peace. Yet the calm was tinged with curiosity. The 7 strangers who had spent the night in her cabin were now awake, and their presence brought an unfamiliar energy to her home. Martha moved quietly through the cabin, careful not to wake anyone unnecessarily. She wanted to maintain the sense of order she had always relied upon. Life alone meant she could move freely without concern for others. But now, she had to consider their comfort. She quietly refilled the kettle for tea and brought out fresh bread and some cheese she had set aside for herself. The smells of breakfast began to fill the cabin, mixing with the earthy aroma of the wet wood and smoke from the stove. One by one, the men began to stir. Daniel, the man who had spoken for the group the previous night, stretched and rubbed his eyes, offering Martha a polite nod. Peter and Luis whispered quietly among themselves, while the others began to move about, tending to their wet clothes or checking their backpacks. Despite the cramped space, everyone showed care not to disturb the cabin or Martha's belongings. This simple act of respect impressed her. She had expected disorder, perhaps complaints or nervous tension, but instead there was a quiet cooperation. Martha prepared a larger tray of tea and breakfast items and called out, "Breakfast is ready." The men gathered around the small table, sitting carefully on the wooden benches and floor cushions. They ate with polite appreciation, and small conversations began to flow. Daniel thanked her again for the night's shelter, his voice sincere. "We were not sure we would find safety," he said. "You saved us," Martha simply nodded. "I'm glad you're all safe," she replied. She did not feel the need to dwell on compliments. For her, helping someone in need was just the right thing to do. As they ate, Martha noticed subtle differences in the group. Some were clearly more accustomed to the outdoors, moving with ease and familiarity in the cabin and forest. Others, like Peter, appeared less experienced and sometimes hesitated when handling small tasks. She realized that while they were all traveling together, they each brought their own strengths and weaknesses. The situation, she thought, was a small reflection of the world at large. Different people, different skills, all trying to navigate life together. After breakfast, Martha suggested they dry their clothes and shoes by the fire. The men followed her instructions, laying garments carefully near the warmth without touching any of her personal belongings. While they worked, Martha observed them closely. There was Daniel, who seemed quietly responsible, guiding the younger ones gently. Peter was hesitant but eager to learn. Raj and Simon quietly helped each other, showing gestures of patience and teamwork. Martha felt a sense of relief. Their behavior reassured her that they were indeed trustworthy, at least for now. Despite the calm, Martha could feel a subtle tension in the air. Living alone for years had made her cautious, and she knew that 7 people in a small cabin could easily tip the balance from comfort to chaos. She decided to test her instincts carefully, engaging in conversation and watching reactions. "How did you all end up together?" she asked casually, keeping her tone neutral. Daniel explained, "We're all friends from different parts of the country. Some of us knew each other before, some met during this trip. We planned to hike for a few days, but the storm caught us off guard. We lost our map, our phone signals disappeared, and we weren't sure where to go next." His explanation was straightforward, with no unnecessary details. Martha appreciated the honesty. As the morning passed, Arthur and the men settled into a rhythm. She offered small chores to each of them, stacking firewood, clearing debris from the porch, sweeping the floor, and they followed her guidance carefully. She found herself talking with Daniel about the forest, the wildlife, and ways to survive in the outdoors. He asked questions respectfully, eager to learn but careful not to appear intrusive. Their conversation flowed naturally, with Martha feeling a rare sense of camaraderie. For the first time in years, she shared her knowledge with others, and it was surprisingly rewarding. Yet, there were moments when Martha's instincts reminded her to stay cautious. She noticed the subtle ways humans could test boundaries without realizing it. A misplaced hand, lingering too long in her personal space, or overly curious questions about her life. She gently redirected their attention to practical matters, like preparing for the rest of the day or organizing their belongings. It was a delicate balance, allowing trust to grow while maintaining her independence. By late morning, the storm had fully passed, leaving the forest glistening and vibrant. Sunlight streamed through the trees, highlighting droplets of water clinging to leaves and branches. The man expressed a desire to explore the surroundings, and Martha agreed. But under her guidance, she warned them about certain areas, pointed out safe paths, and taught them to observe signs of wildlife. For Martha, this was another test of trust. If they respected her instructions, it would show that they were capable of responsible behavior in her world. As they walked, conversations became more personal. Daniel spoke of his work as a teacher. Simon shared stories of his small-town life, and Raj talked about his love for photography. Martha listened politely, offering encouragement but keeping her own life largely private. She realized that sharing her solitude with strangers was a gradual process. While the men were respectful, she knew she needed to maintain boundaries until trust was fully established. The forest around them was alive with sounds and movement. Birds flitted through the trees, squirrels chased one another across the branches, and the faint sound of a distant stream provided a soothing rhythm. Martha felt a strange mix of pride and nervousness. She had created a world she loved, and now she was letting others into it, even if only temporarily. The experience was both exhilarating and intimidating. She reminded herself to stay vigilant, observe behaviors carefully, and maintain control of her space. By afternoon, they returned to the cabin. Martha offered lunch, simple sandwiches, fresh fruit, and water, and the men ate with appreciation. Afterward, they settled into quieter activities. Some helped with chores, while others simply rested or observed the forest through the windows. Martha noticed small moments of kindness among them. Daniel helping Peter adjust a wet shoe, Raj quietly handing a towel to Simon, and Luis offering food to Javier. These gestures reassured her. Respect and cooperation, she realized, were just as important as survival skills. As evening approached, Martha felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. She had successfully managed the situation for a full day, and her instincts about their trustworthiness had largely been confirmed. Yet, she knew that the night could bring new challenges. 7 adults in a small cabin meant limited space, and any signs of tension could escalate quickly. She began preparing the cabin for the night, arranging blankets, lighting the stove, and ensuring everyone had enough warmth and comfort. Before dinner, she spoke to the group about her expectations. "We must respect each other's space," she said calmly. "Tonight, we sleep in the cabin together, but everyone must keep their voices low and their movements careful. I want this to be safe and comfortable for everyone." The men nodded in agreement, and their respectful response further reinforced her confidence. She realized that while solitude had been her comfort for years, the right people, treated with honesty and boundaries, could coexist peacefully, even in a small space. Dinner was quiet but pleasant. Simple food, shared with politeness and conversation kept at a gentle tone, created a sense of warmth. Martha observed each person carefully, noting how they interacted, how they respected her rules, and how they contributed to maintaining harmony. It was a delicate dance of trust, patience, and mutual respect. She realized that the night ahead would be another test of both their patience and hers. As darkness fell, the cabin became a sanctuary from the outside world. The storm's remnants were long gone, leaving a crisp, clear night filled with stars. The men prepared for sleep, carefully laying out blankets as Martha had instructed. Some whispered quietly, sharing reflections about the day, while others sat silently, lost in thought. Martha watched them with a mixture of curiosity and vigilance. She understood that trust was fragile and could be broken easily if boundaries were crossed. Finally, as everyone settled down, Martha allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had spent years alone, building a life of careful routines and independence. Now she had opened her doors to strangers, trusting them with her safety, space, and comfort. The experience was both nerve-wracking and rewarding. She felt a strange sense of connection, a reminder that even in the most remote places, humans were drawn to each other, not out of necessity alone, but also out of curiosity, respect, and shared experience. Martha lay down, listening to the soft breathing of the men around her and the distant sounds of the forest. She felt a quiet pride in having balanced caution with kindness, independence with cooperation. Tonight would be another test, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a small sense of hope that the night could pass peacefully, that trust could grow, and that her solitary life might be touched by unexpected friendship. Night fell quietly over the forest, though the world outside Martha's cabin was far from silent. Crickets chirped steadily, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. The gentle rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a stream created a soft, natural rhythm. Inside the cabin, however, the energy was different. 7 men who had spent the day huddled together outside during the storm now shared the small space with Martha, a woman who had lived alone for years. The combination of unfamiliar faces, cramped quarters, and the lingering memory of the storm created a unique tension. Martha moved carefully, making sure everyone had a blanket and enough warmth from the stove. She noticed small signs of fatigue and anxiety, shivers, restless movements, and quiet whispers among the men. She realized that despite their politeness, being in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by someone they did not fully know, was stressful. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that her calm presence could help ease the tension. She poured herself a small cup of tea and quietly joined them near the fire, keeping her movements gentle and deliberate. Daniel, the leader of the group, noticed her presence and offered a polite nod. "Thank you again for letting us stay here," he said softly, his voice almost blending with the crackling fire. "We would have been completely lost if we had stayed outside." Martha smiled faintly. "I'm glad you're safe," she replied. "It's not easy being in the forest when you're unprepared. But now, at least, you have a warm place to rest." The men settled quietly, some sitting cross-legged on the floor, others leaning against the walls. The cabin was warm, the fire casting a soft glow that flickered across wooden walls and ceilings. It was intimate, almost cozy, yet Martha could sense the underlying tension that came with 7 strangers sharing her home. She decided to initiate conversation to create a sense of comfort and control. "Tell me about your day before the storm," Martha said, keeping her tone light but attentive. "Where were you hiking, and what were you hoping to see?" Daniel spoke first. He described their route through the nearby mountains, the challenges they had faced, and the beauty they had hoped to experience. He spoke with honesty, carefully choosing words that showed respect for the space they now occupied.
Others added short comments, recalling moments of awe, exhaustion, or laughter.
Martha listened intently, noting how they interacted and how they treated one another with patience and care. Even as she engaged with them, Martha remained observant. She had learned over years of solitude how to read small signs of behavior, a nervous glance, a gesture of cooperation, or a moment of hesitation. These small details told her more than words ever could. She noticed that Daniel often guided others quietly, offering suggestions without dominating the conversation. Peter seemed anxious but eager to participate, while Luis and Raj exchanged small, encouraging gestures that reflected teamwork and mutual respect. These observations reassured her that the group was fundamentally trustworthy, even in unfamiliar circumstances. Hours passed, and the men grew tired. Martha suggested that some of them rest, while others quietly occupied themselves with small tasks. Thomas and Simon helped tidy the cabin, stacking firewood and arranging blankets, while Daniel and Luis sat near the fire, talking softly. Peter and Raj remained close to the stove, warming themselves and listening to the soft crackle of the flames. Martha observed, realizing that even in a confined space, the men were maintaining a balance of order, respect, and individual comfort. Despite the calm, Martha felt a subtle shift in energy as night deepened. Being alone for years had made her highly sensitive to changes in her environment, and she could sense the tension that sometimes emerges when strangers are together for extended periods. She decided to address it gently. "It's a long night ahead," she said, her voice calm and steady. "We should make sure everyone is comfortable and has enough space. If you need anything, ask politely, and I'll help if I can." The men nodded, their expressions reflecting understanding and appreciation. Martha noticed how small gestures of kindness began to emerge. Daniel offered to share his blanket with Peter when he saw the younger man shivering. Raj quietly handed a towel to Simon, who had accidentally spilled some water. Luis and Javier helped move blankets closer to the stove to ensure everyone stayed warm. Martha felt a mixture of relief and admiration. These acts, small as they were, demonstrated empathy and respect, qualities that were often rare in the wider world, but essential for harmony in this intimate setting. As the night deepened further, conversation naturally slowed. Soft murmurs replaced chatter, and the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Martha used the time to reflect on the experience. She had lived for years without the presence of others, relying entirely on her own skills and judgment. Now, she had shared her sanctuary with 7 strangers, trusting them with her safety and space. It was an unusual and somewhat unsettling experience, but it also brought a strange sense of connection. At one point, a sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin's wooden shutters, and the firelight flickered across the room. Peter flinched visibly, and Thomas instinctively moved closer to reassure him. Martha spoke softly, her voice steady. "It's just the wind. The cabin is safe. Everything is fine." Her calm reassurance seemed to settle the group. It reminded her of the power of presence, how one person's composure can influence the mood and security of an entire group. Later, Daniel approached Martha quietly, lowering his voice. "You manage all of this so well," he said. "It's not easy to live alone in a place like this, and yet you remain calm, organized, and kind."
Martha smiled faintly.
"It comes with practice," she replied, "and with respect for the forest and the people around me. You all are being careful and respectful, which makes it easier." The exchange felt sincere, a quiet acknowledgement of mutual trust forming between her and the men. Appearing between her and the men. As the night wore on, Martha realized that the group had begun to relax. They no longer moved nervously or spoke in hushed, uncertain tones. The atmosphere became warmer, filled with subtle laughter, soft conversation, and quiet appreciation of the fire's warmth. Even Peter, who had appeared the most anxious, now smiled occasionally and joined small discussions, though still respectful of boundaries. Martha felt a small thrill of relief. This night, which had begun as a test of trust, was evolving into a lesson in human cooperation, empathy, and patience. Around midnight, Martha decided to share a story from her own experience, careful to keep it neutral and relatable. She spoke of the first winter she had spent alone in the cabin, the long nights by the fire, and the lessons she had learned from observing the forest. She described small adventures, discovering wild berries, tracking animal footprints, and the occasional encounter with wildlife. The men listened intently, asking questions respectfully and sharing their own thoughts. This exchange deepened the sense of connection, creating a rare bond between a woman who had lived in solitude and strangers who had entered her world. Eventually, exhaustion took hold. One by one, the men lay down, carefully arranging their blankets and adjusting their positions near the stove. Martha ensured that everyone was comfortable before returning to her own corner of the cabin. The fire burned low, casting a soft glow that illuminated faces relaxed with rest. For a moment, Martha allowed herself to feel a sense of peace. Despite the unusual circumstances, the night had passed without conflict, tension, or fear. It was a small miracle, she thought, a testament to respect, trust, and human kindness. As she lay in bed, listening to the quiet breathing and occasional soft movement of the men around her, Martha reflected on the delicate balance she had maintained. She had opened her home, her sanctuary, and her life to strangers, trusting that they would honor her boundaries. And they had. The experience reminded her that while solitude offered safety and control, connection, when approached with respect, could be equally enriching. Martha's thoughts drifted to the morning that awaited them. They would leave eventually, she knew, and her life would return to its familiar rhythm. But for tonight, she allowed herself to feel something she had not experienced in a long time, a quiet satisfaction in having shared her life, however briefly, with others. She realized that trust, patience, and empathy could turn strangers into allies, even in a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. The night passed slowly, filled with a sense of calm accomplishment. Martha had navigated fear, uncertainty, and responsibility, creating a safe, warm space for 7 strangers. In return, she had witnessed gestures of respect, cooperation, and humanity that reminded her of the rare but meaningful ways people could connect. She fell asleep with a quiet sense of pride, knowing that the forest had tested her boundaries and that she had met the challenge with grace and intelligence. Morning arrived quietly over the forest, with golden sunlight streaming through the tall trees and painting the cabin walls in soft, warm light. The storm from the previous night was nothing but a memory, leaving behind a refreshed, vibrant forest. Dew sparkled on every leaf and blade of grass, and the distant song of birds filled the air with life. Martha rose early, as was her habit, moving through the cabin with practiced ease. The fire was still warm from the night before, and she carefully stirred the embers, adding a few logs to prepare for breakfast. The 7 men were already awake, moving quietly around the cabin as they began to pack their belongings. Daniel and Peter were arranging their backpacks, while Luis and Raj were folding blankets and stacking them neatly in a corner. Simon and Thomas washed their faces at a small basin of water Martha had prepared, and Javier quietly gathered his things. Despite their exhaustion from the previous day, there was a sense of purpose in their movements. Each man seemed careful not to disturb the cabin, showing respect for Martha's home and her personal space. Martha prepared a simple breakfast, fresh bread, cheese, and a few eggs she had collected from her chickens. She poured tea for everyone and set the small tray on the table. "Eat well," she said softly. "It will help you on your journey." The men gathered around, sitting quietly, each taking a moment to appreciate the warmth and comfort. They had spent a long night in the cabin, and the food and fire offered a sense of normalcy. Conversation was gentle, respectful, and unhurried. Daniel, who had been careful to show leadership the night before, spoke first. "We can't thank you enough for everything," he said. "You not only gave us shelter from the storm, but you also showed us kindness, patience, and respect. Most strangers would not have done the same." Martha shook her head, her expression calm.
"I did what anyone would do," she replied. "You needed help, and I could provide it."
That's all there is to it. She wanted to remain humble, though inside she felt a quiet pride at how well the night had passed. As breakfast ended, Martha took the opportunity to give the men a few final tips for navigating the forest. She pointed out safe paths, areas to avoid, and small natural markers that could help them find their way. Daniel listened attentively, jotting down notes in a small notebook he carried. The others nodded and asked a few polite questions, each eager to learn without overstepping. Martha was pleased by their curiosity and respect, seeing in their actions the proof that trust could be honored even in unusual circumstances. Once breakfast was finished and the advice given, the time came for the men to leave. Martha walked with them to the edge of the forest, ensuring they could find the path that led back towards civilization. She felt a mix of emotions: relief because the cabin would return to the quiet she cherished, and a subtle wistfulness because the group had brought an energy and warmth that her solitary life had not seen in years. Daniel spoke quietly as they prepared to part ways. "Will you be okay on your own?" he asked. "You've done so much for us, and yet you live all alone here." Martha smiled faintly. "I'm used to it," she said. "I've chosen this life because it suits me. But tonight reminded me that even people who live alone can connect with others, if the situation calls for it." He nodded thoughtfully, and there was a quiet understanding between them. No further words were necessary. Both knew that this encounter had left a mark on all of them. The men began to move along the path, their figures slowly disappearing into the forest. Martha watched them carefully, making sure they were following the route she had suggested. Each step they took felt deliberate, showing caution and respect for the unfamiliar surroundings. When the last man disappeared from view, she turned back toward her cabin, feeling the familiar sense of solitude settle around her. The forest was quiet again, the only sounds being the gentle wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Back inside, Martha reflected on the experience. For years, she had lived alone, relying entirely on herself for safety, comfort, and companionship. The cabin, the forest, and her routines had been her only constants, yet the night with the 7 men had reminded her of something important. Humans, even strangers, could bring warmth, learning, and connection when approached with honesty and respect. She thought about the small gestures of kindness she had witnessed, the shared blankets, the careful attention to her rules, and the polite interactions. Each one had reinforced the idea that trust, though delicate, could be nurtured. Martha moved through her cabin, tidying up and returning everything to its usual place. The blankets that had been used were folded neatly, dishes washed and set aside, and the fire prepared for the next evening. Everything was as she had left it before the storm, yet the cabin now felt subtly different. It was as if the night had left an invisible mark, a quiet reminder that her world, though solitary, could coexist with others under the right circumstances. As she prepared a small cup of tea and sat on the porch, Martha reflected further. She thought about each man individually, imagining how the experience might stay with them. Daniel with his careful leadership, Peter with his eagerness to learn, Luis and Raj with their quiet acts of kindness, and the others. All had played a part in the delicate balance of the night. Their actions had reminded her that humanity at its best could be cooperative, thoughtful, and generous. Martha also considered herself. She had faced uncertainty, fear, and the responsibility of hosting 7 strangers in her home. She had navigated the situation with calm, patience, and observation. In doing so, she had strengthened her own confidence and reaffirmed her abilities. Solitude had taught her self-reliance, but the experience had also taught her that empathy, patience, and understanding were equally important, even when life brought unexpected visitors into her world. Throughout the morning, Martha wandered through her garden, tending to her plants and checking on her chickens. Each small task reminded her of the normalcy she loved in her daily routine. Yet every glance at the path leading to the forest reminded her of the 7 men and the night they had shared. She smiled quietly to herself, thinking about the stories they had told, the careful respect they had shown, and the small ways they had honored her space. For a solitary woman, it was a profound reminder of the simple, unexpected connections that life sometimes offered. Later in the day, Martha sat on her porch again, tea in hand, watching sunlight dance on the leaves. The forest seemed alive in a new way, as if it too acknowledged the events of the night before. She reflected on the balance between solitude and community, realizing that her life, though chosen in isolation, could also accommodate brief moments of connection without losing its essence. The experience had been challenging, but it had also been rewarding, showing her that trust, respect, and kindness could flourish even in the most remote and unexpected places. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Martha felt a sense of peace unlike any she had known. Her cabin, her forest, and her routines were intact, yet she had gained something intangible, the reassurance that humanity could be kind, considerate, and cooperative. She realized that even when living alone, life could bring lessons in empathy, trust, and understanding, lessons that she would carry with her long after the men had disappeared into the distance. Martha prepared dinner for herself, the familiar comfort of her routine grounding her after the extraordinary experience. She reflected on the night again, appreciating the small, quiet gestures that had made it possible: polite conversation, shared effort, patience, and mutual respect. She realized that while solitude allowed for independence, trust and empathy were what made life richer, even for someone who lived alone. By nightfall, the forest was calm and quiet, just as it had been before the storm, but something had shifted for Martha. The cabin felt warmer, not just because of the fire, but because of the memory of shared humanity. She had learned that even in isolation, people could enter her world without disrupting it, and that boundaries, when respected, could create a safe space for connection. For the first time in a long while, she felt a quiet sense of hope, not for companionship necessarily, but for the understanding that the world could bring moments of trust, respect, and kindness when least expected. As she sipped her final cup of tea for the day, Martha gazed out at the darkening forest, stars beginning to appear in the sky above. She thought about the 7 men and the night they had shared, appreciating the lessons she had learned from them without needing them to know. Her life would return to solitude tomorrow, as it always had, but now it carried a new richness, a reminder that even in the middle of nowhere, life could bring unexpected encounters that left lasting impressions.